Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 165, Shakespeare's Tutor, a conversation with Darren Freebury-Jones. In today's guest episode, it's a very welcome return to the podcast for Darren Freebury-Jones. Darren appeared previously to discuss his book Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers, and I asked him back on this occasion because his earlier book, Shakespeare's Tutor, The Influence of Thomas Kyd, is now published in a paperback edition by Manchester University Press, making it a much more accessible resource for any enthusiast of early modern theatre. In our conversation about the book, Darren mentions a few points, like the detail of verse structures and characters like Robert Greene and Thomas Nashe, that we discussed in more detail in our earlier conversation. If you would like to listen to that again, it's still out there on the podcast feed as episode 126. That's season 6, episode 13. Dr. Darren Freebury-Jones is author of the monographs Reading Robert Greene, Recovering Shakespeare's Rival, Shakespeare's Tutor, The Influence of Thomas Kyd, and Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers. He is also associate editor for the first critical edition of the collected works of Thomas Kyd since 1901. He's investigated the boundaries of John Marston's dramatic corpus as part of the Oxford Marston Project and is general editor for the collected plays of Robert Greene, also published by Edinburgh University Press. His findings on the works of Shakespeare and his contemporaries have been discussed in national newspapers such as The Times, The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Observer and The Independent, as well as on BBC Radio. His debut poetry collection, Rambling, was published by Broken Sleep Books in 2024. In 2023, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society in recognition of his contributions to historical scholarship. I spoke to Darren over Zoom. In the book, you highlight several similarities between Kyd and Shakespeare, and really the first of which is their education. As that's always a matter of very great interest to anyone who's exploring Shakespeare's world, perhaps you could take us through your thoughts on that.
Yes, absolutely. And first up, Phil, thanks so much for having me back on this fantastic podcast. So when it comes to the educations of these men, we believe that Shakespeare would have gone to King's New School in Stratford-upon-Avon, which was just a short walk from his home in Henley Street. Now, we have an oral tradition that John Shakespeare bred his son for free at a grammar school. And we don't have the enrolment records for Shakespeare entering that grammar school, or indeed the records for any other young boys of that period, just as we don't have the records for Robert Greene, who famously called Shakespeare an upstart crow, attending grammar school. Now, we don't think that Shakespeare went to university, and that's also applicable to Thomas Kyd. So in 1565, Thomas Kyd entered Merchant Taylor's School in London, and he would have been taught by the formidable scholar and educationalist Richard Mulcaster. Mulcaster was a big advocate of performing Latin drama in school, music and games, so I think that would have equipped Thomas Kyd very nicely for a playwriting career. And grammar school education was very robust during the period. They worked these young boys very hard, and it was pretty much the equivalent of a modern classics degree today. So schoolboys would have spent a long time hunched over the works of classical Latin writers such as Terence, Horace, Ovid and Virgil, and we see the influence of these writers, particularly Ovid, in early Shakespeare and throughout Thomas Kyd's surviving corpus as well. So there was a real emphasis during the period on imitation, translation, parody, telling existing stories, but in refreshing, inventive, innovative ways. So they have quite a similar background in comparison to other Elizabethan playwrights on the scene when Shakespeare begins his career. And it's quite interesting, I think, something I explore in the book that you touched upon is that Shakespeare, early Shakespeare, and Thomas Kyd's dramatic styles are more similar than they are to university educated playwrights. So university educated playwrights tend to have a habit, I think, of showing off their learning.
Right.
So we get lots of classical references, lots of naming of classical figures. And my sense with Shakespeare and Kyd is that they're more conscious of not alienating their audience. And they're more similar in terms of their verse style as well. There's a lot more linguistic flexibility in terms of extra 11th syllables at the conclusion of blank verse lines. Thomas Kyd is the real innovator here, and Shakespeare follows his verse style far more closely than Marlowe's mighty line, for example, which is largely end-stopped, consisting of 10 syllables per line. And Thomas Kyd also has a lovely habit of compounding words such as flaxen-haired, stately written, or pinky-eyed. And this has long been seen as a Shakespearean tick. But again, Kyd's got there first. And I think he was in part influenced by French dramas, such as the work of Robert Garnier, whom he translated. So they are something of outsiders in the dramatic world of the Elizabethan period, Shakespeare and Thomas Kyd being non-university educated. And I'm reminded of a line in a university play, The Return to Parnassus, which is, few university men pen plays well, and our fellow Shakespeare puts them all down. And while I don't necessarily agree with that, I think the grammar school, as opposed to a grammar school and university education, benefited Shakespeare and Thomas Kyd in some respects because they seem more audience conscious. They're more proficient in their use of rhetoric, these figures of repetition that they would have spent a long time learning at grammar school. And I think that distinguishes them from the likes of Robert Greene, Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Nashe, and so on.
Interesting. One of the things that is often held up as the reason why people won't believe that William of Stratford was Shakespeare is that he didn't go to university. Yet here we seem to have a good indication that actually it is one of the things that distinguishes him, the fact that he didn't go, and we can identify that in the work.
I think so. Yes, I think it was a formidable learning journey, grammar school education. And I think combined with Shakespeare's background as a player, he actually had quite a privileged background in terms of being equipped to write great poetry and produce great drama.
Yes, and a dash of natural talent as well, we have to assume.
Of course, a dash of natural wit, yes.
So moving on to the plays themselves, Kyd is credited with a now lost version of Hamlet, and there's an anonymous version of King Lear that he's also credited with. Can you tell us something about those and how you see that those influenced Shakespeare's versions?
Yeah, so we have a lost Hamlet play, usually dated to the late 1580s. And the first reference to this lost play occurs in university-educated writer Thomas Nashe's preface to fellow university-educated playwright Robert Greene's pamphlet Menaphon. So Thomas Nashe speaks of a writer who's heavily dependent on the works of Roman tragedian Lucius Annaeus Seneca. So Seneca responsible for plays such as The Madness of Hercules, The Phoenician Women, Agamemnon, and so on. And Nashe says that this writer will afford you whole Hamlets, I should say handfuls of tragical speeches. Now, Thomas Kyd very much saw himself as a tragic descendant of the Roman playwright Seneca. And I think we can credit Kyd with bringing and refining Seneca for the so-called common stages. And Nashe mentions the kid in Aesop, which strikes me as quite an obvious pun on Thomas Kyd's surname. Lots of dodgy puns and invectives of the period. We might remember Robert Greene's invocation of Shake Scene as well, for instance.
Yes.
And the kid in Aesop has left the trade of noverint. So this writer was a professional scribe, a writer of the court letter. And that's precisely what Thomas Kyd's father's occupation was. So he was a scrivener, and it's been conjectured that Thomas Kyd followed in his father's footsteps because his handwriting in a couple of letters addressed to Sir John Pickering is remarkably neat. So we have this writer who's moved his tidy hand into playwriting, and he's prone, I should say, to bodge up a blank verse with ifs and ands. And we have a line in Thomas Kyd's blockbuster, The Spanish Tragedy: "What villain, ifs and ands?" And this is the first example of that phrase used by a dramatist prior to Thomas Nashe's account. And Thomas Nashe also complains that this writer will thrust Elysium into hell, which is precisely what Thomas Kyd does in The Ghost of Andrea's prologue in The Spanish Tragedy. And this writer also has the audacity to meddle with Italian translations. Now, Italian translations were quite rare in the period, but this is something that Thomas Kyd did. He translated Torquato Tasso's Padre de Familia in a work known as The Householder's Philosophy. Now, Nashe actually uses the plural. He speaks of these shifting companions, but the Kyd biographer Arthur Freeman points out that this is something that Nashe was apt to do. He often uses the plural form even when a specific sneer is aimed at an individual. So I think the evidence for Thomas Kyd's authorship of this lost play is very compelling. It cannot be definitive, but I don't think any other writer matches Nashe's profile. Certainly not Shakespeare, if we were going along with this theory that the first dreadful quarto of Hamlet is representative of an early draft of Shakespeare of the 1580s. I think it's far more likely that Shakespeare's using this lost Hamlet play as a basis for his great tragedy, which he writes around the turn of the century, 1600s. And we know that the old Hamlet play was performed at Newington Butts Theatre in 1594. And a couple of years after the records of its performance, we have Kyd's schoolfellow from Merchant Taylor's, Thomas Lodge, writes about this play and a ghost crying miserably in the theatre like an oyster wife, "Hamlet, revenge." So that phrase, "Hamlet, revenge," doesn't appear in any of Shakespeare's versions of Hamlet, and it was frequently parodied by writers of the period. But what we learn in those accounts, apart from one line of the play, "Hamlet, revenge," is that the play featured a ghost. And this is a real innovation because none of the Hamlet's antecedents feature a ghost. So we go back to the work of Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus or Francois de Belforest's translation of the Amleth or Hamlet myth. So this older Hamlet play introduces the ghost, and of course the ghost provides the tragic impetus for Shakespeare's play. And Kyd, like Shakespeare, loved ghosts, and there he's very influenced by the work of Seneca. So I mentioned the ghost of Andrea in the Spanish Tragedy. You also have the ghost of Pompey turns up while Cornelia, the heroine of Thomas Kyd's Cornelia play, is sleeping. So ghosts and references to the supernatural suffuse Thomas Kyd's works. So yes, we have a lost play in Hamlet, which Shakespeare seems to have used for inspiration for arguably his most famous tragedy. But then we have a surviving earlier true chronicle history of King Lear play, which the first record of the performance of that play is also 1594 at the Rose Theatre, when the companies, the Queen's Men and Sussex's Men, were performing together. And like all of Shakespeare's sources, the true chronicle history of King Lear ends happily, with Lear restored to the throne and his daughter Cordelia, as she's surviving, as she's named in that play, surviving. So I think this is testament to Shakespeare's craftsmanship when he comes to write King Lear around 1605. You can imagine audiences are familiar with the Lear tale through their Holinshed or Geoffrey of Monmouth, or perhaps this older play. And Shakespeare uses that in order to subvert expectations, to pull the rug from under audience members' feet and provide arguably the most devastating conclusion to any work of literature or theatre when Lear enters the stage holding the corpse of Cordelia in his arms. It's an ending that the critic Samuel Johnson couldn't bear to reread. So the true chronicle history of King Lear has been linked to Thomas Kyd for many years. The first attribution to Kyd was from the great editor Edmund Malone,
Yes.
as recorded by James Boswell in 1821. And there are significant similarities in terms of verse style, in terms of the frequency of those unstressed 11 syllables I mentioned, in terms of vocabulary, in terms of overall craftsmanship, and the play is satiated with Thomas Kyd's distinct phraseology. So if you attribute this older King Lear play to Thomas Kyd, as well as this Lost Hamlet play, we could argue that two of Shakespeare's four major tragedies might not very well exist without Thomas Kyd, which I think is testament to Kyd's enduring influence on Shakespeare.
Yeah, that's quite a thought, isn't it? Certainly one of the things that struck me going through the early Shakespeare plays is how early on he starts subverting the genres that he was working in, and must have been causing quite some surprise in the playhouses, really from the start. And then the other thing that has struck me is they must have been a close-knit group, this gang of London playwrights. And I know, we stretched the timeline a bit, but Kyd, Greene, Shakespeare, and the others, they all seem to be referencing each other in really quite subtle ways sometimes, and then sometimes not very subtle ways as well.
Yes, I think, in almost all instances, we don't have direct evidence that Shakespeare met the likes of Thomas Kyd or Christopher Marlowe, but this is a narrow and intensely competitive and collaborative world that Shakespeare is entering in the late 1580s or early 1590s with London. And these dramatists are having a lot of discussions, often via interpretatively malleable pamphlets, about what constitutes great drama, what are the best dramaturgical approaches, and commenting on how to make your verse style jet upon the stage, and attempting to bombast out a blank verse as the best of other writers. So certainly, I think these playwrights were aware of each other and had most likely met and spent some time together, if not in the theatres, then potentially in the local pubs.
I'm sure. And we spoke about this a bit last time, so I won't linger on it, but we mustn't forget the lingering influence of the Spanish tragedy over the whole of the period.
Yes, it was a hugely influential play, the Spanish tragedy. And what's quite interesting is that authorship attribution scholars, so scholars who try to work out who wrote what during the period with anonymous plays or collaborative plays, major scholars now unanimously agree that Shakespeare had a hand in the 1602 additions to Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy. So this is the fourth edition of the play. And I find that quite interesting because for a long time, those editions were associated with Ben Jonson, who was paid to expand the Spanish tragedy in 1601 and 1602. Yes. But there are references to the famous painters scene, which strikes me as eminently Shakespearean, in the late 1590s, particularly in the works of John Marston, the dramatist responsible for his Antonio plays. So when you consider that and you think, well, Shakespeare quite likely to have had a hand in these editions in the late 1590s. That's interesting when you think of Shakespeare's authorship of Hamlet around 1600, because it's long been recognized that Shakespeare uses the Spanish tragedy as a model for Hamlet. You've got a play within a play used for vengeful purposes. You've got a ghost crying for revenge. You've got murder in an orchard. So I think the Spanish tragedy very much spurs Shakespeare's Hamlet. And if we go along with the notion that Kyd was also responsible for a lost Hamlet play, then you do get the sense of Kyd's ghost haunting Shakespeare's arguably most famous tragedy.
That's a lot about tragedy, but interestingly, you make an argument that there's an ongoing influence from Kyd on Shakespeare in comedy as well, and particularly in the way that there's a mix of comedy and tragedy in Shakespeare's plays.
Yes, absolutely. So Ben Jonson references Sporting Kyd. And like I mentioned earlier, I think Kyd's got a very pun-worthy surname, but Sporting Kyd indicates to me that Kyd was also known for his comedy. And he gets quite a bad rep from older scholars in particular, who see him as a bombastic writer, as a rhetorician rather than a poet. But what Kyd does quite brilliantly, I think, is he conflates tragic and comic materials, and you get a particular strain of black comedy in his plays. So his plays feature more puns than the likes of Christopher Marlowe, for instance. So he has the Machiavellian schemer in the Spanish tragedy. He orchestrates it so that one goon named Pedringano gets another goon out of the way. And he says to Pedringano, "I'll see that you'll mount for this." And Pedringano then finds himself on the scaffold, but he's been promised by Lorenzo that a page is going to enter with his pardon in a box. And he's so confident in this that he mocks the executioner upon the scaffold and essentially jests himself to death. So this is the kind of dark comedy we see in Thomas Kyd. And I think that has a pervasive influence on other dramatists, including Shakespeare. I think there are a lot of echoes of Thomas Kyd's language in early comedies such as The Two Gentlemen of Verona and The Taming of the Shrew, for instance. And I think Shakespeare is interested in Kyd's style of comedy, but also the intrigue elements of his plays, which make for great dramatic ingredients in terms of tragedy, but can easily be transposed over to the comic genre as well. So it's worth considering Kyd's influence, not just in terms of dark tragedy, but also light comedy. I think there are shades of grey in Kyd's works that haven't been necessarily noted in as much detail as they might by scholars of bygone eras.
Right. And does his influence go on beyond Shakespeare?
Yes, I certainly think so. So Kyd shared a room with Christopher Marlowe. And I think in Marlowe's later plays, you get a sense of Kydian dramaturgy. So I mentioned Lorenzo in the Spanish tragedy. He is the prototypical Machiavellian schemer on the stage. So you see his influence on the likes of Barabbas in The Jew of Malta or the Duke of Guise in The Massacre at Paris. And I think Marlowe's later plays become more darkly humorous, particularly The Jew of Malta. And I think there you see Kyd's influence. And Robert Greene as well as a far more important dramatist for the evolution of the commercial stage than is often credited. You see the influence of Kyd as his dramas progress. We often think of Robert Greene as a playwright who was obsessed with Marlowe, and I think he was a bit. I think Marlowe infected Greene's works like a disease. He was wrestling with the Tamburlaine plays throughout his career. I think he was inspired by Dr. Faustus when he came to write Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay. But you get a sense when you chart Greene's plays in terms of their chronology of growing Senecanism And this is very much what Kyd is bringing to the stage, that refinement of Seneca. Greene's language becomes more rhetorical in a Kydian and Senecan way as his career progresses. And Greene is also conflating comic material with darker aspects that we would associate with the tragic genre as his career progresses. So I think Kyd had a profound influence on his Elizabethan contemporaries, and it might surprise us to hear that when Shakespeare comes to write Hamlet at the turn of the century, he's taking something of a commercial risk. The revenge tragedy had gone rather stale. You think of earlier examples such as Titus Andronicus with its 14 deaths, its mutilations, decapitations, and a mother being tricked into eating her own sons who have been baked in a pie. But then Hamlet, I think that triggers a renewed interest in the tragic genre and a renewed interest in Thomas Kyd. Kyd's Spanish tragedy is often parodied, but when something is frequently parodied, there's often testament to how popular it is. So you have later writers such as John Marston with his tragedy, Antonio's Revenge. He's engaging closely with Thomas Kyd there. I think you see the influence of Kyd on the Revenger's tragedy, usually attributed to Thomas Middleton. John Webster's dark tragedies, such as The White Devil, The Duchess of Malfi. So speaking of that ghost of Thomas Kyd as a dramatist who, like Shakespeare, had a real predilection for ghosts, I think that ghost of the dramatist himself is haunting the playing scene for a very long time and well into the Jacobean period.
My thanks to Darren for taking the time to speak to us today. Shakespeare's Tutor, The Influence of Thomas Kyd, is now published in paperback by Manchester University Press. It's available from wherever you get your books, and I've put some links to that in the show notes. Next time, it will be on with the journey through Shakespeare's plays, with a look at the first part of Henry IV. In the meantime, if you've not done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.